China is working incredibly aggressively to dominate.
And your administration is helping them now by giving them these tax subsidies. And we are losing thousands of jobs because of your climate mandates that are forcing our production overseas and gutting our workforce. I don't understand it.
Finally, Senator Hawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Turk, thank you for being here. Nice to see you again. Thanks to both of the witnesses for being here. I wanted to just talk a little bit about who is really benefiting from this administration's climate agenda and from these draconian electric vehicle mandates. So, Mr. Turk, you've already alluded to this. I know you know the answer to these questions. Currently, one nation accounts for 60% of the world's electric vehicle production. That nation is?
China.
Yeah. One nation accounts for 76% of the world's lithium-ion battery production. That nation is?
China.
Yet your administration, this president's administration, the mandates that you put in place require that 2/3 of our new vehicle sales in just the next 8 years, 2/3 of them, be electric vehicles. Your policies are driving us and our supply chains into the hands of our greatest geostrategic enemy, enriching them, enriching their government, while forcing Americans to pay for electric vehicles that on average cost $7,000 more on average than a traditional vehicle, are more expensive to repair and insure, require more frequent replacements of everything from tires to component parts. So, Mr. Turk, why is it good for the American worker that we force our supply chains to a country that's our greatest rival and adversary? And why is it good for the American consumer?
So this is exactly why we're using all the tools that Congress gave us to diversify our supply chains, from the mining piece and especially the processing piece, which is where China really has a stranglehold. So we're making significant progress on lithium, on graphite, you name it, the tools that you all have given us to diversify those supply chains and make sure that we're getting the benefits of that. Our U.S. workers are getting the benefits of that. Citizens in St. Louis, I mentioned in my opening statement some exciting investments that are going on in St. Louis. We want U.S. Workers to benefit from this supply chain and this revolution. And China is absolutely competing. China is going whole hog on EVs and the full supply chain of it. And they're going to compete and outcompete unless we're playing and pushing back and competing with them with what we're doing.
Here's what I don't understand then. Why is it, if that is the case, why is it that you are interpreting the administration's climate law, so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which I think, frankly, is bad enough on its own, but you're reinterpreting it now to allow the tax credits to flow to Chinese entities. So now U.S. tax dollars are literally subsidizing Chinese battery makers. Why would we want to do that? Why would we want to not only give our adversary our supply chains and our jobs, but pay them to take them from us? Why does that make any sense?
So I would argue, and certainly want to turn to my Deputy Secretary at Treasury, we are not doing that.
How are you not?
The fact that with the 30D tax credit, only 13 models qualify at this point. Now, we hope more diversification happens and more models qualify for that tax credit is a good data point that we take this very seriously, and we want to have these jobs in the U.S. But let me
wait. I just want to stay with you, Mr. Turk, just because my time is so limited, and this is an important part, and the chairman's brought this up, and I'm glad that he has. This is really, really important. The Inflation Reduction Act, which I did not vote for, but nevertheless, the Inflation Reduction Act said clearly that China, if you are a foreign entity of concern, which includes China, you don't get the taxpayer subsidy. You don't get the 30D subsidy. You don't get the tax break. And yet your rule allows Chinese companies to get the tax break. It loosens up the restrictions. So now we are subsidizing our rivals. I just don't understand. The chairman's asked you about this repeatedly. I don't understand why we would pay Chinese companies to outcompete us.
So I would strongly disagree with that. I spent a lot of time working with the team, and we worked hand in hand with our Treasury colleagues on the FEOC, the Foreign Entity of Concern, the FEOC standards, and happy to go through the three prongs of that in particular in terms of what our proposal is on the table.
Well, that's the problem, right? Is that the law, which again I didn't support, but the law says just no. It says no. And then you come back and say, it's what we lawyers like to call a multi-factor balancing test, which is usually what courts do when they want to get their way. So it's like, oh, well, let's complicate it. We've got all of these different things. And the effect of it is, this has been widely reported. This isn't my opinion. Everybody understands that what it does is it allows Chinese companies so long as they're not set up within mainland China, but owned and controlled by China, they can now get the tax credit. I just don't understand why we would use our tax money to pay the Chinese to make these vehicles.
So we're not. Only 13 models, again, have qualified for that 30D tax credit. A lot of companies right now, automakers, are scrambling and they're working urgently to make sure that they don't have that.
If your rule had no effect, why would you change it? Why wouldn't you just leave the text of the IRA in place? Why wouldn't you, the flat bar?
All of this is implementing the legislation that's been passed. And happy, again, to get into the details. Certainly if...
Last thing I've got, because my time's expired, I know other senators are waiting to ask questions, but this is important, just about the effect on American workers. Just looking at the news reporting on this, if Ford CEO says that EVs are going to require 40% less labor to produce than traditional cars, as production is shifting to the United States, this labor on, for instance, batteries, EV batteries, is increasingly being done in factories that are co-owned at least by foreign entities, and the wages for workers who are usually not unionized are substantially less than the wages for workers in traditional cars. Now, you mentioned my state. In Wentzville, Missouri, for example, we have almost 4,000 workers in a GM plant there. That's just one plant in just one area of my state. Believe me, I'll take all the jobs you can give me. But I don't want those 3,000 workers to lose their jobs and to have another couple hundred created in some other state in a factory co-owned by a foreign company making half the wages. And that seems to be the trade-off that you're offering to American workers. That doesn't seem like a good trade-off to me. With that, I yield, Mr. Chairman. If you want to respond, Mr. Chair, go ahead, but I yield, Mr. Chairman.
I just reiterate the number of jobs, 136,000 jobs, thanks to these tools that you've given us, thanks to this president, all across the country, including in St. Louis, but all across the country. That's an incredible record, and there are incentives, as the chairman well knows, to make sure these are good-paying jobs that we have all across the country.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Turk, I just want to come back quickly to this question about workers, because I just think it's so important. You know, my friends on the other side of the aisle said that they believe that the overriding crisis is the climate. I just respectfully disagree with that. I think the overriding crisis we're facing is the wages and jobs of American workers. And it truly is a crisis for many, many American families who, you know, both spouses have to work, even when they both work. I'll just tell you a story about in Wentzville, Missouri, recently the UAW strike. I was out on the picket line, and I was listening to one of the workers there who is my age. I'm 44. He's my age, so he's not a young man anymore. And he was telling me that he has to, even working full-time and working overtime, he can hardly afford. In fact, he said it takes him 2 paychecks to be able to pay for his rent. In Wentzville, Missouri, you know, this isn't Manhattan, this isn't New York City. You know, this is Wentzville, Missouri. This is an affordable place. That's the crisis we're facing. So in light of that, tell me why this is a good thing. This is from an article in Axios. I just want to quote, even as battery cell production shifts to the United States, that labor will likely be done by non-union workers at factories co-owned by foreign companies. And they, meaning the workers, will make less money than workers at traditional powertrain factories. The article goes on. For example, battery cell factories under construction in Kentucky and Tennessee are co-owned by Ford and a Korean company. They are starting their workers at, on average, $14 an hour less. $14 an hour less than workers who are making engines and transmissions for traditional vehicles. How is that good for American workers?
So let me start with a thanks for focusing on this issue. One of the reasons I got into the government and took this job is I grew up in Illinois, right next to Missouri, although the northwest corner of the state. I was just back visiting with my folks over the holidays. Rock Falls is the name of the hometown, and it's a steel mill community. We've had those in West Virginia and other parts of the country as well. And when I was growing up, the steel mill was basically shutting down my entire childhood. So I got to see very directly what that means to a community, right? The dysfunction that causes in families, the fact that parents can't provide for their kids, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is near and dear to my heart. I'm honored to work for Secretary Granholm, who was governor of Michigan, who has real life experience in terms of the changes happening in the auto industry and how we can be smart working together and proactive to make sure we've got jobs for folks, high quality, high paying jobs. I also think we're smart enough in the U.S. I think we're exceptional, and we can have those high-quality jobs. We can make sure we've got affordability for our consumers, and we can make sure we tackle climate change as well. Transportation is the largest source of our emissions in our country, and we need to take that head-on.
But I appreciate that answer, Mr. Turk, but you haven't really answered my question. I mean, let me read to you from another article. This is the Associated Press, and this isn't quoting someone. This is just a statement of fact. And I quote, "If electric vehicles replace gas-powered ones, most UAW workers, for example, at engine and transmission plants, will lose their jobs. And if lower-paying battery plants aren't union, workers won't have anywhere near the same wages and benefits." So here, my nightmare scenario is that we repeat, because of this administration's climate agenda, climate fixation, I would argue, we repeat and hypercharge the loss of industry we saw in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, and we do it all over again. And so the remaining few things that we actually produce in this country, like automobiles, we won't produce anymore. And we may produce a few things, but even those will be co-owned with foreign companies. I mean, you mentioned steel. U.S. Steel, an iconic American company, backbone of our steel production in this country, is apparently about to sell to a foreign company. I hope your administration is going to block that sale. I've urged the president to block it. He should absolutely block it. But for heaven's sake, let's not see what remains of our proud and strong auto industry be completely co-opted by foreign governments, foreign entities, and U.S. workers are left with very little. I mean, that's just a nightmare scenario. Wouldn't you agree?
So I'm a firm believer in playing offense. And I think we're playing offense right now. I think we're being intentional. We're being aggressive. We're being purposeful. The fact that we have 136,000 new jobs.
I don't think giving tax subsidies to Chinese companies is
including
playing offense, Mr. Turk.
1,250 new jobs in Missouri because of these investments, because of these targeted, directed investments, planning for the future and making sure we're winning and competing against China. China is working incredibly aggressively to dominate.
And your administration is helping them now by giving them these tax subsidies. And we are losing thousands of jobs because of your climate mandates that are forcing our production overseas and gutting our workforce. I don't understand it.
Everything we're doing in this space, and happy to go chapter and verse on all the provisions that we're working on, is to reshore, to make sure that these jobs, to make sure this economic opportunity is U.S. and our allies across the world. We've got a huge economic opportunity here. And the last thing we need to do is sit by idly like what we've done in our country for too long. We're stepping up. We're playing offense. We're winning right now. My biggest fear is that someone puts a brake on it and we're not able to compete. Right now we're competing and we're starting to win.
My biggest fear is that the Wall Street banks, they make a bunch of money on it because they've all invested in these foreign companies. And the foreign companies make a bunch of money on it. And we lose thousands of American jobs and American workers get their pay cut in half. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for indulging me.